"She's not breathing right. Please, she's a pilot. She's sick. Just let me help her." 14-year-old Charlotte Landrum's voice cracked as she lunged toward her mother's crumpled form on the cold detention room floor. Officer McCarthy's hand shot to his holster, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Stay back, kid. This fainting spell isn't going to stop the investigation into these fraudulent documents." Minutes earlier, Captain Sarah Landrum had walked through customs with the quiet confidence of someone who'd landed 747s in thunderstorms. Her uniform was immaculate, crisp white shirt, gold epaulettes catching the fluorescent lights. Nearly 2 decades of flawless service. Federal credentials that had cleared her through 100 international gateways. None of it mattered now. A smudged secondary ID. That's all it took for McCarthy to pull her aside, his skepticism dripping with contempt. "Ma'am, we see a lot of sophisticated ruses in here." Sarah's chest tightened. Not now. Not here. She'd felt the warning signs, the flutter in her ribcage, the tunnel vision creeping in from the edges. Her heart condition, usually managed, was surging under the crushing weight of being treated like a criminal in front of her daughter. Then her knees buckled. The metallic clang of her head narrowly missing the bench echoed through the windowless room. Charlotte's sneakers squeaked against linoleum as she rushed forward. McCarthy's belt clicked as he stepped between them. A woman who conquered the skies at 40,000 feet was dying on a government floor, and the man with the power to save her refused to move. This is the story of Captain Sarah Landrum, a story of excellence betrayed, authority abused, and a daughter who watched her hero fall. What happened in that detention room didn't just destroy one family, it exposed a culture of suspicion that had been hiding in plain sight for years. And before it was over, it would change federal law forever. Sarah Landrum didn't just fly planes. She lived in the sky. Her journey began at 22, fresh out of college, with a degree in aerospace engineering and a dream that most people told her was unrealistic. "Women don't become airline captains," her own flight instructor had said during her first lesson. "They wash out when the hours get tough." Sarah made it her mission to prove him wrong. She started as a flight instructor herself, logging hours in single-engine Cessnas with nervous student pilots who white-knuckled the controls. She worked overnight cargo routes, flying old 727s stuffed with packages across empty Midwestern skies while most people slept. She took every extra shift, studied every manual, practiced emergency procedures until they became muscle memory. By 30, she was a first officer for a major international airline. By 35, she'd earned her 4th stripe, the mark of a captain. By 41, she was a senior captain, one of the most respected pilots in her fleet, trusted with the longest routes and the newest aircraft. Her record was spotless. Not a single incident. Not a single passenger complaint. 18 years of perfection. But perfection came at a cost. Sarah was what her colleagues called a, quote, checklist obsessive. Every procedure followed to the letter. Every regulation memorized. She arrived at the airport 3 hours early for international flights, inspecting her crew, her aircraft, her paperwork, with the intensity of someone who knew that one mistake could end everything she'd built. Her daughter Charlotte once asked her, "Mom, why do you always look so serious before you fly?" Sarah had smiled, kissing her forehead. "Because up there, sweetheart, serious keeps people alive." That perfectionism extended beyond the cockpit. Sarah kept her personal struggles private. When her husband left when Charlotte was just 5, Sarah never missed a day of work. When her mother passed away from a sudden heart attack, the same condition Sarah had inherited, she flew a transatlantic route the next day, her grief locked away in a compartment she refused to open. "Never let them see you weak," she told herself. "Never give them a reason to doubt you." It was a mantra that had served her well in an industry that still questioned whether women belonged in the captain's seat. But it was also a mantra that was slowly killing her. The heart condition, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, had been diagnosed 5 years earlier. Manageable with medication and stress reduction, her cardiologist had said. But stress reduction wasn't an option for someone flying international routes, raising a teenage daughter alone, and constantly proving she deserved to be in that left seat. Sarah carried her medication everywhere. A small amber bottle in her flight bag, in her purse, in the glove compartment of her car. She'd never needed it in an emergency. Until the day she did. If Sarah's first love was the sky, her second was Charlotte. Charlotte Marie Landrum was 14 years old, whip-smart, and utterly convinced her mother was a superhero. She kept a scrapbook of every newspaper article that mentioned Sarah's achievements. Local pilot lands disabled aircraft safely. Captain Landrum receives Aviation Safety Award. Breaking barriers, women in the cockpit. But their most sacred tradition had nothing to do with headlines. Before every international trip, Sarah and Charlotte had a ritual. Sarah would sit on the edge of Charlotte's bed in her full uniform, and Charlotte would carefully pin the wings onto her mother's jacket, a small golden emblem that Sarah had earned decades ago but still wore with pride. You ready to bring people home safe, Captain? Charlotte would ask, her voice mock serious. Always ready, co-pilot, Sarah would reply, saluting. Then they'd hug, tight and long, and Sarah would whisper the same words every time. I'll be back before you know it. Love you to the moon. And back again, Charlotte would finish. It was cheesy, it was sentimental, and it was theirs. Charlotte understood that her mother's job wasn't just a career, it was a calling. She'd grown up in airport terminals, doing homework in pilot lounges while Sarah prepared for flights. She'd watched her mother command respect from co-pilots twice her size, navigate diplomatic crises with difficult passengers, and land planes in conditions that would terrify most people. Sarah was her hero, not because she was perfect, but because she never quit. The trip that changed everything was supposed to be routine, a 14-hour flight from Tokyo to their home gateway, scheduled to land on a Tuesday morning. Charlotte had pinned her mother's wings the night before Sarah's departure, both of them laughing about Charlotte's upcoming algebra test. Bring me back something weird from the duty-free, Charlotte had joked. You got it, kiddo, Sarah had promised. Neither of them knew that the next time Charlotte saw her mother, it would be on the floor of a detention room, fighting for her life. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you love be treated unfairly and felt completely powerless to stop it? That's what Charlotte experienced. And what's coming next is going to show you just how far one man's abuse of authority can go. If this story is resonating with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. This channel is dedicated to uncovering true stories of injustice and the people who fought back. Your support helps us keep bringing these important stories to light. Now let's meet the man who turned a routine customs check into a nightmare. Officer Daniel McCarthy had worked for Customs and Border Protection for 12 years, and in that time, he developed a very specific worldview. Everyone was lying until proven otherwise. To be fair, CBP officers deal with difficult situations. They're the first line of defense against smuggling, human trafficking, and security threats. It's a job that requires vigilance, attention to detail, and a healthy dose of skepticism. But McCarthy had crossed the line from vigilance into paranoia years ago. His colleagues noticed it. The way he'd spend twice as long on certain travelers, usually well-dressed women, especially women of color. The way his jaw would tighten when someone presented, quote, too many credentials, as if having proper documentation was itself suspicious. The way he'd mutter under his breath about entitled professionals who thought they were above scrutiny. One coworker later testified that McCarthy once said, "The ones in the fancy uniforms are always the worst. They think they can just flash a badge and skip the line." Sarah Landrum was exactly the type of traveler McCarthy despised. When she approached his station that Tuesday morning, McCarthy saw a black woman in an expensive pilot's uniform, walking with the posture of someone who expected to be respected. To Sarah, this was simply professionalism. To McCarthy, it was arrogance. "Passport and customs declaration," he said, barely looking up. Sarah handed them over with a polite smile. She was exhausted. The Tokyo flight had been turbulent, and she'd barely slept in 24 hours, but she maintained her professional demeanor. Charlotte stood beside her, backpack slung over one shoulder, eager to get home. McCarthy examined the passport with exaggerated slowness. He held it up to the light. He flipped through every single page, even though Sarah's entry and exit stamps were clearly visible. He typed something into his computer, waited, typed again. "Occupation?" he asked, even though her passport listed it. "Airline captain," Sarah replied evenly. "Uh-huh." McCarthy's tone made it clear he didn't believe her. "And this is your daughter?" "Yes, sir. She travel with you often, when her school schedule allows." McCarthy's eyes narrowed. "Interesting. Must be nice, all that free travel." Sarah felt the first flutter of unease. This wasn't standard questioning. This was something else. Then McCarthy picked up her secondary ID, her airline-issued security credential, and his expression changed. There was a small smudge on the lamination, barely visible, probably from being handled by security at Tokyo's Narita airport. "Ma'am, this ID has been tampered with." Sarah's heart skipped. "I'm sorry, what?" "This lamination. It's been compromised." "That's a federal offense. That's not tampering. That's just wear from. I'm going to need you to step over here." McCarthy gestured to a separate area, away from the main customs line. Secondary screening. Charlotte's hand found her mother's. "Mom? It's okay, sweetheart," Sarah said quietly, though her chest was already tightening. "Just a misunderstanding." But as McCarthy led them toward a windowless room at the far end of the customs hall, Sarah realized this wasn't a misunderstanding at all. This was a hunt, and she was the prey. The room was small, sterile, and deliberately intimidating. Gray walls, fluorescent lights that buzzed with a frequency that made Sarah's head ache, a metal bench bolted to the floor, a desk with a computer that McCarthy positioned himself behind, creating a physical barrier between him and Sarah. Charlotte sat beside her mother on the bench, her hand still gripping Sarah's. Sarah could feel her daughter's pulse racing through her palm. "Mom, why are we in here?" Charlotte whispered. "It's fine," Sarah murmured, though nothing about this felt fine. McCarthy spread Sarah's documents across the desk, like evidence at a crime scene. Passport, pilot's license, airline security credential, her medical certificate, her federal flight crew ID. "So," McCarthy began, his tone shifting from bureaucratic to accusatory, "you're claiming to be a captain for a major international airline." "I'm not claiming anything," Sarah said carefully. "I am a captain. Those credentials are all valid and current." "Uh-huh. And I'm sure you've got a good explanation for the discrepancy in your security badge." "There is no discrepancy. That's just normal wear." "Ma'am, I've seen every kind of fraudulent document that exists. And let me tell you, some of these forgeries are sophisticated, real sophisticated. People go to great lengths to create false identities." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but you can verify my credentials with a single phone call to my airline security department, or to the FAA, or to—" "I'll verify what I need to verify in my own time," McCarthy cut her off. "Right now, what I need is for you to explain why someone would go through the trouble of creating such an elaborate false identity. What are you really bringing into this country?" The accusation hung in the air like poison. Charlotte's eyes widened. "My mom's not a smuggler. She's a pilot. Just call her airline. Young lady, I'm going to need you to be quiet while I conduct this investigation." Sarah squeezed Charlotte's hand. "Stay calm," she told herself. "Don't give him ammunition. Don't show weakness." But her body was betraying her. The stress of the flight, the lack of sleep, the confrontation, it was all converging into a perfect storm for her heart condition. She could feel the irregular rhythm starting, the flutter that meant her heart was working too hard, struggling to maintain normal function. She needed her medication. It was in her purse, just feet away on the bench beside her. "Officer McCarthy," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I need to take my medication. I have a heart condition, and stress can trigger." "Nice try," McCarthy interrupted. "The old 'I'm sick' routine. I've seen that one before too. I'm not trying anything. I have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's documented in my medical records. My medication is in my bag right there. You're not touching anything until I've completed my search of your belongings." Sarah felt panic rising. This is a legitimate medical need, and this is a legitimate federal investigation. You'll wait until I'm done. McCarthy turned his attention to Sarah's purse, methodically removing each item and examining it with theatrical suspicion. Wallet, keys, lipstick, a paperback novel, Charlotte's algebra homework that Sarah had been helping her with during the flight, and the amber prescription bottle. McCarthy held it up to the light, squinting at the label. "Disopyramide. That's a controlled substance. It's a prescription cardiac medication," Sarah said, her breathing becoming more labored. "My name is on the bottle. My doctor's information is right there. I need to take it now." "Uh-huh. And how do I know this bottle contains what the label says?" Sarah's vision was starting to blur at the edges. The flutter in her chest had become a pounding. She could feel sweat beating on her forehead, despite the air-conditioned chill of the room. "Officer, please. I'm asking you as a human being. I need that medication." McCarthy's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, if you're really having a medical emergency, we'll get you medical attention. But I'm not going to be manipulated by someone trying to avoid legitimate questioning." "I'm not trying to," Sarah's voice cracked. "I just need—" The room tilted. Charlotte's voice seemed to come from far away. "Mom! Mom!" Sarah's last coherent thought, before her knees gave out, was that she'd broken her promise. She wasn't going to make it home. She wasn't going to pin on her wings again. And Charlotte was going to watch it all happen. The human body has limits. For Sarah Landrum, that limit arrived at exactly 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in a CBP detention room. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a condition where the heart muscle becomes abnormally thick, making it harder for the heart to pump blood. For most people with HCM, the condition is manageable with medication and lifestyle modifications. But stress, particularly acute severe stress, can trigger a crisis. Sarah's heart had been sending warning signals for the past 20 minutes. The irregular rhythm, the chest tightness, the shortness of breath. These weren't subtle hints. They were alarm bells. But Sarah had spent her entire career ignoring alarm bells in favor of maintaining control. In the cockpit, that discipline saved lives. In McCarthy's detention room, it was killing her. The moment her knees buckled, Charlotte screamed. Not a normal scream of surprise, but the primal, terror-filled scream of a child watching her parent die. Sarah hit the floor hard, her shoulder taking most of the impact. Her pilot's cap rolled across the floor. Her carefully pressed uniform crumpled. The gold epaulets that Charlotte had admired that morning now pressed against cold linoleum. "Mom!" Charlotte dropped to her knees beside Sarah, her hands shaking as she grabbed her mother's shoulders. "Mom, wake up! Please wake up!" Sarah's eyes were half open, unfocused. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. A thin line of blood appeared at her temple, where her head had grazed the edge of the metal bench on the way down. Charlotte looked up at McCarthy, tears streaming down her face. "Call 911. She has a heart condition. She needs help." McCarthy stood behind his desk, his hand moving to his holster, a reflexive gesture that spoke volumes about how he viewed this situation. Not as a medical emergency, as a potential threat. "Stay back from her," he ordered. "What?" Charlotte's voice broke. "She's dying. Call someone. This could be a ploy. I've seen suspects fake medical emergencies to create chaos and escape. She's not faking. Look at her. Look at her." Sarah's lips were turning pale. Her fingers twitched against the floor. The irregular heartbeat that she'd been fighting to control had progressed into a full arrhythmia. Without intervention, without her medication or emergency medical care, her heart could stop entirely. Charlotte grabbed her mother's purse, fumbling for the prescription bottle that McCarthy had confiscated during his investigation. "I need her pills. Please, just let me give her the pills." McCarthy stepped around the desk, positioning himself between Charlotte and the medication. "Put the bag down. She needs this. You heard her say she has a heart condition. I said put it down." Charlotte's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the purse. Tears blurred her vision. Her mother, her hero, her only parent, the strongest person she'd ever known, was dying on the floor, and this man with a badge and a gun was stopping her from helping. "Please," Charlotte begged, her voice breaking into sobs. "Please, she's all I have. Please don't let her die. Please." For a moment, just a fraction of a second, something flickered in McCarthy's eyes. Doubt, maybe, or the recognition that this had spiraled beyond his control. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "This fainting spell isn't going to stop the investigation into these fraudulent documents," he said, his voice cold. "Now step back, or I'll have to restrain you for interfering with a federal officer." Charlotte stepped back, not because she wanted to, but because she was 14 years old and terrified, and a man with authority and a weapon had just threatened her. She watched her mother's chest rise and fall in irregular, struggling breaths, and she felt utterly, completely powerless. "I need you to pause and think about something." Charlotte was 14. She'd just watched her mother, a woman who commanded passenger jets, who'd spent decades proving her competence and earning respect, reduced to a crumpled figure on a detention room floor. And the man who had the power to help refused to do anything. If this makes you angry, you're not alone. What happened next would spark outrage across the country. But we're not there yet. Please take a moment to like this video and share it. Stories like this need to be told. They need to be heard. And they need to make us ask hard questions about who we give authority to, and what happens when that authority goes unchecked. Let's continue. The detention room had a camera, a small ceiling-mounted unit that was supposed to record every interaction for accountability and legal protection. Later, during the lawsuit, attorneys would discover that McCarthy had manually disabled it 17 minutes into Sarah's detention. But in that moment, as Sarah Landrum lay unconscious on the floor and her daughter sobbed helplessly, there was one person who saw everything. Officer Jennifer Reyes. Reyes was a 6-year veteran of CBP, stationed at the same facility as McCarthy. She'd noticed his pattern of targeting certain travelers, but like many of her colleagues, she'd kept quiet. The culture of the agency didn't reward whistleblowers. It punished them. But when she walked past McCarthy's detention room and heard a child screaming, something inside her snapped. She opened the door without knocking. The scene that greeted her would haunt her for the rest of her career. A woman in a pilot's uniform, unconscious on the floor, blood trickling from her temple. A teenage girl on her knees, sobbing. And McCarthy, standing over them both with his hand on his holster, his expression one of stubborn defiance. "McCarthy, what the hell is going on?" Reyes demanded. "Routine investigation. Suspect is attempting to evade questioning by faking a medical emergency." Reyes looked at Sarah's gray pallor, her labored breathing, the way her fingers were curled against her chest. This wasn't faking. This was a woman in acute distress. "Did you call medical?" "I'm handling it." "Did you call medical?" A pause. "Not yet." Reyes pulled out her radio. "This is Officer Reyes. I need emergency medical to detention room 4 immediately. We have an unconscious female, mid-40s, possible cardiac event." McCarthy stepped forward. "Officer Reyes, I didn't authorize." "I don't give a damn what you authorized," Reyes snapped. "This woman is dying." She dropped to her knees beside Sarah, checking her pulse. Weak and erratic. She looked at Charlotte. "Sweetheart, does your mom have medication she needs to take?" Charlotte nodded frantically, pointing to the prescription bottle on McCarthy's desk. Reyes grabbed it, read the label, and quickly administered 2 pills, supporting Sarah's head and helping her swallow with small sips from a water bottle. It wasn't protocol. Technically, CBP officers aren't supposed to administer medication, but Reyes didn't care about protocol. She cared about keeping a woman alive. "Stay with me," she murmured to Sarah. "Help is coming. You're going to be okay." Charlotte clutched her mother's hand, whispering through tears, "Mom, please. Please wake up. I need you, please." The next 4 minutes felt like hours. Paramedics arrived, wheeling in a stretcher and emergency equipment. They quickly assessed Sarah's condition, confirming what Reyes had already suspected: acute cardiac arrhythmia triggered by extreme stress. They started an IV, administered additional medication to stabilize her heart rhythm, and prepared to transport her to the nearest hospital. "Is she going to be okay?" Charlotte asked one of the paramedics, her voice small and broken. "We're doing everything we can, sweetheart," the paramedic said gently. "She's stable for now." As they lifted Sarah onto the stretcher, her eyes fluttered open briefly. Unfocused, disoriented, but open. "Charlotte," she whispered. "I'm here, Mom. I'm right here. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize," Charlotte said, tears streaming down her face. "Just stay with me. Okay? Just stay with me." The paramedics wheeled Sarah out of the detention room, Charlotte following close behind. Officer Reyes accompanied them, her hand on Charlotte's shoulder, a small gesture of comfort in an ocean of trauma. McCarthy stood alone in the empty room, surrounded by scattered documents and evidence of his catastrophic failure of judgment. He should have called for help the moment Sarah mentioned her heart condition. He should have administered her medication when she requested it. He should have treated her like a human being instead of a suspect. But he'd chosen his pride over her life. And now, he was about to discover that pride had a very steep price. Sarah Landrum woke up in a hospital bed with electrodes attached to her chest, an IV in her arm, and a uniformed CBP officer standing outside her door. She was still being guarded, still being treated as a suspect. The rage that ignited in her chest at that moment was unlike anything she'd felt in her 41 years of life. Charlotte was asleep in a chair beside the bed, her head resting on the mattress, her hand still clutching her mother's. Her face was puffy from crying, her eyes red-rimmed even in sleep. Sarah's cardiologist entered shortly after she woke, explaining that she'd experienced a severe arrhythmia triggered by acute stress. The medication Officer Reyes had administered, combined with the emergency treatment by paramedics, had saved her life. But it had been close. Dangerously close. "Your heart rhythm stabilized, but you need rest," the doctor said firmly. "No stress. No flying for at least 6 weeks while we monitor your condition. 6 weeks without flying. 6 weeks of grounding." For a pilot, it was worse than being hospitalized. But that wasn't what made Sarah's hands shake with fury. It was the guard outside her door. "Doctor, why is there an officer stationed outside my room?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The doctor looked uncomfortable. "CBP has requested you remain under supervision, pending completion of their investigation." "Investigation into what?" "My credentials are legitimate. My passport is legitimate. Everything I told that officer was the truth. I understand, but I don't have authority over." "Get me a phone," Sarah interrupted. "Please. I need to make a call." The call was to Marcus Terrell, one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country. Sarah had heard him speak at a conference on aviation diversity 2 years earlier. She'd kept his card, never imagining she'd need it. Now she needed it desperately. Terrell listened to Sarah's story without interrupting. When she finished, there was a long pause. "Captain Landrum," he said finally, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Are you prepared for what comes next? Because if we pursue this, it's going to be public. It's going to be ugly, and CBP is going to come after you, with everything they have." Sarah looked at Charlotte, still asleep, still holding her hand. She thought about her daughter's screams, the way McCarthy had stood over her with his hand on his weapon while she was dying, the way he'd dismissed her credentials, her professionalism, her humanity. "Mr. Terrell," Sarah said quietly, "I didn't spend 18 years breaking barriers in this industry just to let some power-hungry bureaucrat treat me like a criminal in front of my daughter. I'm not doing this for money. I'm doing this because what happened to me is happening to other people. And it needs to stop." "Then we're going to war," Terrell said. "And we're going to win." Marcus Terrell didn't just file a lawsuit. He built a case that exposed an entire culture. The discovery process, the legal phase where both sides exchange evidence, became a goldmine of damning information. First, there was McCarthy's deleted body cam footage. CBP policy required all detention room interactions to be recorded. McCarthy had manually disabled the camera 17 minutes into Sarah's questioning, claiming later that it was a, quote, technical malfunction. But the system logs told a different story. The camera had been intentionally turned off. And this wasn't the first time McCarthy had done it. Over the previous 4 years, McCarthy had experienced technical malfunctions with his body camera 43 times, all during detentions of minority travelers, particularly women. Then there was McCarthy's history. Terrell's team uncovered 16 formal complaints filed against McCarthy over his 12-year career. Complaints of racial profiling, excessive detention times, verbal harassment, denial of bathroom access during extended questioning. None of the complaints had resulted in serious discipline. A few written warnings. One mandatory sensitivity training session that McCarthy had dismissed as politically correct nonsense. The pattern was undeniable. McCarthy targeted people who reminded him of his own insecurities. Educated professionals, women in positions of authority, people whose credentials and confidence made him feel small. But the most damning evidence came from McCarthy's own colleagues. Officer Reyes agreed to testify, breaking the agency's code of silence. She described a culture where backing up your fellow officer meant looking the other way when they crossed lines. She detailed conversations where McCarthy had openly mocked travelers, using racial slurs and sexist language in the break room. He once said that women pilots were just, quote, glorified flight attendants who convinced someone to give them a license. Reyes testified during her deposition. I asked him if he'd ever actually flown a plane. He told me to mind my own business. Other officers came forward, speaking anonymously at first, then publicly as the case gained media attention. They described quotas, unofficial but very real, that encouraged officers to conduct secondary screenings on a certain percentage of travelers, even when there was no legitimate cause for suspicion. The quotas created an incentive structure where officers like McCarthy could justify targeting anyone who looked wrong or acted suspicious, regardless of whether they actually posed a security risk. And then there was the smoking gun, McCarthy's personal emails. Subpoenaed during discovery, his emails revealed a pattern of disturbing communications with like-minded colleagues. Messages mocking travelers. Jokes about hotshot pilots who think they're above the law. Complaints about diversity hires in the aviation industry. One email, sent just 3 weeks before Sarah's detention, read, "Saw another one of those affirmative action captains today. Bet she can barely reach the pedals. How many real pilots lost out on that job so the airline could meet a quota?" When Terrell read that email aloud during a press conference, the media firestorm began. Sarah's story, which had been treated as an isolated incident by CBP's public relations team, suddenly became emblematic of a much larger problem. News outlets picked it up. Civil rights organizations rallied. Pilots' unions issued statements of support. Captain Sarah Landrum wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who'd ever been profiled, targeted, or dehumanized by someone with a badge and unchecked authority. The lawsuit took 14 months to resolve. 14 months of depositions, document reviews, media interviews, and sleepless nights. 14 months of CBP attorneys trying to paint Sarah as an opportunist, questioning her medical records, suggesting that her heart condition was pre-existing and therefore not their responsibility. But the evidence was overwhelming. In March of the following year, CBP agreed to a settlement. The terms were staggering. $5.2 million in damages to Sarah and Charlotte Landrum. $3.7 million in punitive damages, money specifically designated to punish the agency for its negligence. And most importantly, a complete overhaul of CBP's detention and medical response protocols. The settlement required every major international gateway to have independent medical monitors on duty 24/7. Officers would no longer have discretion to deny medical care or medication. Any traveler who requested medical assistance would be immediately assessed by a licensed healthcare professional, not by the officer conducting the detention. Body cameras would be mandatory and tamper-proof, with automatic uploads to a secure server. Disabling a camera would result in immediate suspension pending investigation. And McCarthy? He was terminated, stripped of his badge, his pension reduced, and permanently barred from working in any federal law enforcement capacity. But the real legacy wasn't the money or even the policy changes. It was the law that came after. Inspired by Sarah's case, Congress passed the Landrum Act, federal legislation requiring all CBP facilities to implement independent medical oversight and establishing criminal penalties for officers who knowingly deny necessary medical care. The law passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, because regardless of political affiliation, everyone could agree on one fundamental principle. No child should ever have to watch their parent die on a detention room floor, while someone with the power to help refuses to act. Sarah never flew commercially again. The grounding had lasted too long, and the psychological trauma of the incident made it impossible for her to return to the cockpit without experiencing crippling anxiety. But she found a new calling. She became an advocate for aviation diversity and passenger rights, speaking at conferences, testifying before Congress, and mentoring young women entering the aviation industry. Charlotte, now a college student studying public policy, often joined her at these events. The wings that Charlotte had pinned to her mother's uniform that last morning before the flight The wings that had been pressed into cold linoleum during the worst moment of their lives now hung in a frame in Sarah's home office. Below them, a quote that Sarah had chosen. "They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds." Captain Sarah Landrum's story is a reminder that authority without accountability is tyranny, that badges don't grant the right to dehumanize. That silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit. Officer McCarthy abused his power because the system allowed it. He'd done it before, and he would have done it again if Sarah hadn't fought back. But she did fight back, and in doing so, she changed the system. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Stories like this matter because they remind us that individuals can make a difference, even when the odds seem impossible. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, share Sarah's story, because the more we talk about these injustices, the harder it becomes for them to hide in the shadows. And if you or someone you love has experienced something similar, know this: you're not alone. Your story matters, and there are people who will fight for you. Until next time, stay informed, stay angry about the things that matter, and never stop believing that change is possible.